It was one of those crisp autumn mornings when the wind carried the faint smell of leaves. 13-year-old Ethan Miller was pedaling his battered bicycle down Main Street, his backpack slung over one shoulder, when he noticed her. An elderly woman stood on the edge of the sidewalk, gripping a wooden cane with shaky hands. Her silvery hair glinted in the sunlight, and she looked out of place amidst the bustling morning crowd. Ethan slowed his bike, his curiosity piqued. She seemed unsure, her head swiveling back and forth as she stared at the busy crosswalk ahead. Cars zipped by, their tires hissing against the pavement, and the woman took a hesitant step forward, then stopped. There was something about her, maybe it was the slight tremble in her hands or the way her lips moved, as if talking to herself, that made Ethan pull over. "Hey, madam," he called out, hopping off his bike and letting it rest against a lamppost. "Do you need some help?" The woman turned to him, her pale blue eyes meeting his. She smiled faintly, though her expression carried a trace of embarrassment. "Oh, young man, I don't want to trouble you," she said, her voice soft and wavering. "I just need to get across the street, but these cars, well, they move so fast these days." Ethan glanced at the crosswalk light, which had just turned green, signaling the cars to go. He thought about the time school started in 15 minutes, and he couldn't afford to be late again. His teacher, Mrs. Hargrove, had already called home twice this month, and his mom wasn't thrilled about it. But as he looked at the woman, he couldn't bring himself to leave. "It's no trouble," he said, his tone firm in a way that surprised even himself. "I've got time. Here, take my arm." The woman hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Thank you, dear. That's very kind of you." Ethan offered her his arm, and she clutched it tightly, her fingers bony but warm. Together, they waited for the light to change. When it finally turned red, he guided her slowly across the street, matching his pace to hers. Drivers in the waiting cars watched, some with impatience, others with faint smiles. As they reached the other side, the woman let out a small sigh of relief. "You're such a sweet boy," she said, her voice tinged with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd have done without you." Ethan shrugged, brushing off her praise. "It's nothing, really, just glad I could help." The woman smiled again, this time more warmly. "What's your name, young man?" "Ethan Miller." "Well, Ethan, my name is Margaret Bennett. It's a pleasure to meet you." She paused, studying him for a moment. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago, someone very special." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he just nodded politely. "Are you okay from here, Mrs. Bennett?" "Oh, yes, I'll be fine now," she said, patting his arm gently. "Thank you again, Ethan. You've made my day a little brighter." With that, she turned and began walking down the sidewalk, her cane tapping lightly against the ground. Ethan watched her go for a moment before climbing back onto his bike. He pedaled away, feeling an unexpected sense of satisfaction. It wasn't often that he got to do something nice for someone, and it felt good, better than he'd expected. That evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table doing his homework, he casually mentioned the encounter to his mom. "I helped this old lady cross the street today," he said, erasing a mistake on his math worksheet. "Her name was Mrs. Bennett." His mom, a tired-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes from working double shifts at the diner, glanced up from the sink where she was washing dishes. "That was nice of you, Ethan," she said with a small smile. "The world could use more kindness like that." Ethan shrugged again, trying to downplay it. It wasn't a big deal. She seemed like she really needed help. "Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference," his mom said thoughtfully, turning back to the dishes. Ethan didn't think much of it after that. He went to school the next day, hung out with his friends, and spent the weekend playing video games. But the following Monday, as he rode his bike down Main Street again, he spotted Mrs. Bennett sitting on a bench outside the bakery. She waved him over. "Good morning, Ethan," she said cheerfully as he approached. "How are you today?" "Hi, Mrs. Bennett," he said, stopping his bike. "I'm good, how about you?" "Oh, I'm doing well, thank you. I was just enjoying the sunshine." She gestured to the empty space on the bench beside her. "Care to join me for a moment?" Ethan hesitated. He was on his way to the library to pick up a book for his English class, but he figured the errand could wait a few minutes. He parked his bike and sat down. They talked for a while about the weather, about school, about how Main Street had changed over the years. Mrs. Bennett told him stories from her youth, painting vivid pictures of a time when the town was smaller, quieter, and everyone knew their neighbors. Ethan found himself genuinely enjoying her company. There was something comforting about her presence, like a warm blanket on a cold day. Before he left, Mrs. Bennett handed him a neatly folded napkin. "Here," she said with a wink. "I bought an extra cookie from the bakery. I thought you might like it." Ethan grinned, accepting the treat. "Thanks, Mrs. Bennett, you didn't have to do that." "Nonsense," she replied. "It's the least I can do for my new friend." As he rode away, munching on the cookie, Ethan couldn't help but smile. Meeting Mrs. Bennett had been an unexpected highlight in his otherwise ordinary routine, and though he didn't know it yet, their friendship was just beginning. The weeks went by, and autumn deepened, painting the town in shades of amber and crimson. Ethan found himself stopping to chat with Mrs. Bennett nearly every day after school. Sometimes she was on the bench outside the bakery, other times wandering slowly through the park with her cane. Though their conversations started casually, Ethan began to notice the loneliness in her stories. She spoke of her late husband, George, with a wistful smile, and occasionally mentioned her 2 children, both of whom lived far away and rarely visited. "You know, Ethan," she said one afternoon as they sat by the pond in the park, watching the ducks glide across the water, "it's funny how life turns out. When I was your age, I couldn't wait to grow up, to have my own family, my own home. But now that I'm here, I find myself longing for those simpler days, when the biggest worry was what dress to wear to the school dance." Ethan listened quietly, unsure of what to say. He couldn't imagine what it must feel like to have lived so much life and still feel so alone. "Do you think your kids will visit for Thanksgiving?" he asked cautiously. Mrs. Bennett's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, I'm sure they'll call," she said, her tone light but unconvincing. "They're very busy, you know, important jobs, big cities. I wouldn't want to trouble them." Ethan frowned. He didn't like the idea of Mrs. Bennett spending Thanksgiving alone. His own family's holidays were modest, just him, his mom, and their small turkey dinner, but they were always together. As the days grew colder, Ethan started noticing little changes in Mrs. Bennett. She moved slower than before, and sometimes her voice sounded weaker, more tired. One afternoon, as they shared a bench outside the library, she coughed into a handkerchief, the sound harsh and rattling. "Are you feeling okay, Mrs. Bennett?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "Oh, I'm fine, dear," she replied, folding the handkerchief neatly and tucking it into her purse. "Just a little chill in the air, that's all. Nothing a hot cup of tea can't fix." But Ethan wasn't so sure. That evening, while helping his mom clear the dinner table, he brought up Mrs. Bennett again. "Mom, do you think it's normal for an old person to be coughing a lot? Like, really bad coughing?" His mom gave him a curious look. "Why do you ask?" "It's Mrs. Bennett. She's been coughing a lot lately and she seems, I don't know, tired." His mom set the plate she was holding back on the table and sat down across from him. "Ethan, it's nice that you worry about her, but Mrs. Bennett is older. Sometimes older people have health issues. It doesn't necessarily mean something's wrong, but it might be good for her to see a doctor if she hasn't already. Do you think I should say something to her?" His mom thought for a moment. "You could gently ask if she's been to see a doctor recently. But remember, Ethan, sometimes people don't like to talk about their health. You've done so much just by being there for her. I'm sure it means more than you realize." Ethan nodded, though he still felt uneasy. The next day, as he walked his bike down the sidewalk next to Mrs. Bennett, he decided to bring it up. "Mrs. Bennett, have you, been to the doctor lately? You know, just to check up on things." Mrs. Bennett chuckled softly, though her laugh was interrupted by a small cough. "Oh, Ethan, you're such a worrywart. I'm fine, really. Just getting older, that's all." Ethan wanted to press further, but something in her tone told him to let it go. Instead, he changed the subject to something lighter. They talked about the holidays, about her favorite Thanksgiving dishes, and about the little traditions she used to share with her husband. As Thanksgiving approached, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Bennett wouldn't be spending it with anyone. On the Wednesday before the holiday, he stopped by her house after school. He'd never been there before, but she'd mentioned the address in passing during one of their conversations. It was a quaint little house on the edge of town, its shutters painted a cheerful yellow that stood out against the gray November sky. Mrs. Bennett answered the door with a surprised smile. "Ethan, what a lovely surprise. What brings you here?" "I just wanted to check in and see if you needed anything for Thanksgiving," he said, shuffling his feet. "Like, do you have enough groceries? Or maybe I could help you cook something." Mrs. Bennett's eyes softened, and for a moment Ethan thought she might cry. "That's very sweet of you, Ethan, but I'll manage just fine. I've been doing this for a long time, you know." "Are you sure I could?" "I'm sure," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But thank you. You're a good boy, Ethan. You remind me so much of George when he was your age." Ethan nodded, though he still felt a pang of sadness as he rode home. On Thanksgiving morning, as his mom prepared their modest meal, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Bennett. Finally, he grabbed a container of mashed potatoes and a slice of pumpkin pie from the counter. "Mom, I'm going to take this to Mrs. Bennett," he said, already heading for the door. His mom smiled warmly. "That's a wonderful idea, Ethan. Just don't stay too long, we'll be eating soon." When Mrs. Bennett opened the door and saw Ethan standing there with the food, her face lit up. "Ethan, what's all this?" "I just thought you might like some extra food," he said, holding out the container and pie. Mrs. Bennett's hands trembled as she took them. "Oh, Ethan, you didn't have to do this, but thank you, this means so much to me." They sat in her cozy living room for a while, eating and talking. Mrs. Bennett seemed more cheerful than Ethan had seen her in weeks, and it made him happy to know he'd brought her some joy. As he left, Mrs. Bennett hugged him tightly. "You've given me the best Thanksgiving I've had in years, Ethan. Thank you." He smiled, his heart full in a way he couldn't quite describe. But even then, he had no idea just how much his small acts of kindness had meant, or how they would come back to him in a way he could never have imagined. The first snow of the season arrived in early December, dusting the town in a delicate layer of white. Ethan pedaled through the quiet streets after school, his breath puffs of frost in the chilly air. It had been a few days since he'd last seen Mrs. Bennett, and though she'd assured him she was fine when they spoke on the phone, something told him otherwise. He decided to stop by her house, hopping to bring her some holiday cheer with a small poinsettia plant he'd picked up at the market. When he reached the yellow-shuttered house, it looked just as it always did, though the snow on the path to the door was untouched. Ethan knocked and waited, shifting on his feet to keep warm. After a moment, he heard soft footsteps and the door creaked open. Mrs. Bennett stood there, bundled in a thick cardigan, her face paler than usual. "Ethan," she said, her voice warm but tired. "What a lovely surprise." "I brought you this," Ethan said, holding out the poinsettia. "It's not much, but I thought it might brighten things up a bit." Mrs. Bennett's eyes glistened as she took the plant. "It's beautiful. Thank you, dear. Come in before you catch a chill." Ethan stepped inside, the familiar warmth of her home wrapping around him. The scent of cinnamon lingered in the air, likely from the potpourri bowl on her kitchen counter. He noticed her movements were slower than usual as she set the plant on the windowsill. "Are you feeling okay, Mrs. Bennett?" he asked, unable to hide the concern in his voice. "Oh, I'm just a little under the weather," she admitted, sitting down in her favorite armchair. "It's nothing to fuss over. I've been through worse winters than this." Ethan pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "Have you been to the doctor lately?" Mrs. Bennett hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I haven't. It's hard to get into town sometimes, and, well, I don't want to be a bother." "You wouldn't be a bother," Ethan said firmly. What if I went with you? Or maybe I could ask my mom to drive us. Her lips curved into a faint smile. You're too kind, Ethan, but let's not worry about me right now. Tell me, how's school? Are you ready for the holidays? Ethan knew she was deflecting, but he decided not to push. Instead, he told her about the upcoming Christmas program at school and how his class was making ornaments to sell at the winter fair. For the next hour, they talked about everything and nothing, and though Mrs. Bennett's energy seemed to fade the longer he stayed, she didn't seem to want him to leave. When he finally stood to go, she reached out and took his hand. Ethan, she said softly, you have no idea how much your visits mean to me. You've brought light to my days in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. Her words stayed with him as he rode home, the snow crunching under his tires. The next morning, Ethan mentioned Mrs. Bennett's health to his mom over breakfast. She's not doing great, Mom. She said she hasn't been to the doctor in a while. Is there any way we could help her with that? His mom set down her coffee cup and looked at him thoughtfully. I'll see what I can do. Maybe I can ask around to find someone who does house calls. It's a busy time of year, but we'll figure something out. True to her word, Ethan's mom managed to contact a local doctor who agreed to visit Mrs. Bennett at home. Ethan accompanied the doctor to her house the following week, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. Mrs. Bennett was surprised but grateful when they arrived. You didn't have to go to all this trouble, she said, but there was a tremor in her voice that hinted at how much she appreciated the gesture. The doctor examined her thoroughly and prescribed some medication, assuring her that with rest and care, she'd feel better soon. Ethan took it upon himself to pick up the prescription from the pharmacy and deliver it to her that evening. You're spoiling me, Mrs. Bennett said with a chuckle as he handed her the bag of medicine. You deserve it, Ethan replied simply. The days passed, and gradually Mrs. Bennett seemed to regain some of her strength. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, she was well enough to bake a batch of her famous shortbread cookies, which she insisted on giving to Ethan and his mom. Ethan spent part of the holiday break shoveling snow from her driveway and running errands for her. It felt good to help, and he didn't mind giving up his free time. Mrs. Bennett had become more than just a neighbor to him. She was a friend, someone he genuinely cared about. One afternoon in January, as they sat in her living room sipping tea, Mrs. Bennett opened up about her life in a way she never had before. She told Ethan about the years she'd spent working as a school teacher, how she and George had saved every penny to buy their house, and how much she missed the laughter of children filling its halls. I always hoped this house would stay in the family, she said wistfully. But my kids, well, they have their own lives now. It's strange to think about what will happen to it when I'm gone. Ethan didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, letting her words hang in the air. Winter turned to spring, and Mrs. Bennett's health seemed to stabilize. Ethan continued to visit her regularly, even as his schoolwork piled up and soccer practice resumed. She was always there with a kind word, a story, or a plate of cookies, and he found himself looking forward to their time together more than ever. Then one sunny afternoon in late May, everything changed. Ethan was in the middle of mowing the lawn when his mom came outside, her expression somber. Ethan, she said gently, I need to talk to you. He turned off the mower and looked at her, his heart sinking. What's wrong? It's about Mrs. Bennett, she said. She passed away this morning. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. What? He whispered, his voice barely audible. She went peacefully in her sleep, his mom said, placing a hand on his shoulder. I'm so sorry, honey. I know how much she meant to you. Ethan didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at the ground, his chest tight with a grief he didn't know how to express. The next few days were a blur. He attended the small memorial service held at the local church, where a few neighbors and distant relatives gathered to pay their respects. Ethan sat quietly in the pew, his mind filled with memories of Mrs. Bennett's laughter, her stories, her kindness. It wasn't until a week later that the letter arrived. A man in a crisp suit knocked on the door and handed it to Ethan's mom, who called him into the living room to read it. Ethan opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten note from Mrs. Bennett, along with a legal document. "Dear Ethan," the note began, "you've been like a grandson to me in these past few months, and I can't thank you enough for the joy you brought to my life. I want you to know how much you meant to me, and I hope this will help you as you continue to grow into the wonderful young man I know you'll become." Ethan blinked back tears as he read the rest of the letter. According to the attached document, Mrs. Bennett had left him her house and a savings account containing over $10,000. He looked up at his mom, his voice shaking. I don't understand. Why would she do this?" His mom smiled through her own tears. "Because you made a difference in her life, Ethan. You were there for her when she needed someone. This is her way of saying thank you." Ethan sat down, the weight of her generosity sinking in. He thought about Mrs. Bennett, about the countless hours they'd spent together, and about how much she'd come to mean to him. "I just wanted to help," he said softly. "And you did," his mom replied, "more than you'll ever know." The summer air was warm as Ethan stood on the front porch of Mrs. Bennett's house, or rather, his house now. He still couldn't quite believe it. The yellow shutters, the neatly trimmed hedges, the creaky wooden steps, all of it had been hers, and now it was his responsibility. Though he was only 13, the weight of it felt enormous, yet oddly, it also felt right. His mom had been helping him sort through everything. Mrs. Bennett had left detailed instructions in her will, including a note encouraging Ethan to take his time, deciding what to do with the house. For now, he and his mom agreed it would stay exactly as it was. Ethan wasn't ready to let go of the place that had become a second home to him. "Are you sure you want to do this today?" his mom asked, stepping onto the porch behind him. She carried a small box of supplies, a notepad, some envelopes, and a few markers. "We can wait if you need more time." Ethan shook his head. "No, I want to. It feels right." He had spent the past week thinking about how to honor Mrs. Bennett's memory. The idea had come to him while he was sitting in her favorite chair, flipping through one of her old photo albums. Page after page showed smiling children students she had taught over the years. Some of the photos had little notes written on the back, "To Mrs. Bennett, the best teacher ever," or "Thank you for believing in me." It struck Ethan that Mrs. Bennett had spent her life helping others, quietly making a difference. He wanted to do something that reflected that, something that would make her proud. His plan was simple. He would write letters to her former students. He'd found a box of old class rosters in her desk, along with addresses for many of them. His mom had helped him look up the ones that were outdated, using online directories to fill in the gaps. Each letter would share a little about Mrs. Bennett's life in her later years and how much she had cherished her career as a teacher. Ethan hoped that, by reaching out, he could reconnect her students with her memory, maybe even inspire them to pass on her kindness in their own lives. He set the box of supplies on the porch railing and opened the notepad to the first page. "All right," he said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." For the next few hours, he and his mom worked side by side, writing letter after letter. Ethan's hand cramped occasionally, but he didn't mind. Each letter felt like a small gift, a way to keep Mrs. Bennett's legacy alive. By late afternoon, they had finished the stack. Ethan leaned back in his chair, looking at the neatly addressed envelopes with a sense of accomplishment. "Do you think they'll write back?" he asked his mom. "Some of them might," she said with a smile. "But even if they don't, I'm sure they'll appreciate it. It's a beautiful thing you're doing, Ethan. Mrs. Bennett would be so proud." The first response came a week later. A handwritten letter arrived in the mail, addressed to Ethan. He tore it open eagerly and found a warm note from a woman named Claire, who had been one of Mrs. Bennett's students in the 1970s. "Dear Ethan," the letter began, "thank you so much for reaching out. I was deeply saddened to hear of Mrs. Bennett's passing, but your letter brought back so many wonderful memories. She was more than a teacher to me, she was a mentor, a guide, and a friend. I still remember how she encouraged me to pursue my dream of becoming a writer. I wouldn't be where I am today without her support." Claire went on to share a few stories about her time in Mrs. Bennett's class, and at the end of the letter, she included a generous donation to Ethan, asking him to use it for something that would honor Mrs. Bennett's memory. Similar letters began to trickle in over the following weeks, each one filled with gratitude and admiration for Mrs. Bennett. Some included photos of families, others shared personal anecdotes, and a few enclosed small donations. Ethan was overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support. One letter, however, stood out. It was from a man named Richard, who introduced himself as the CEO of a successful publishing company. "Mrs. Bennett was the reason I fell in love with books," he wrote. "She saw potential in me when no one else did, and I've never forgotten her kindness. I'd like to meet you, Ethan, and discuss how I might help you carry on her legacy." Ethan showed the letter to his mom that evening. "Do you think I should call him?" he asked, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. "I think you should," she said. "It sounds like he really wants to help, and who knows, this could lead to something amazing." The next day, Ethan dialed the number Richard had included in his letter. The man's voice was warm and enthusiastic as they spoke, and by the end of the conversation, they had arranged to meet at a local cafe. When Ethan and his mom arrived at the cafe, Richard was already waiting. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a friendly smile. He stood and extended his hand as they approached. "You must be Ethan," he said. "It's a pleasure to meet you. And you must be Mrs. Miller," he added, shaking his mom's hand. "Thank you for raising such an incredible young man." "Thank you for meeting us," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. They sat down, and Richard wasted no time getting to the point. "Ethan, I was incredibly moved by your letter. Mrs. Bennett was a remarkable woman, and it's clear she had a profound impact on your life. I want to help you honor her memory in a meaningful way." He went on to explain his idea: a scholarship fund in Mrs. Bennett's name, dedicated to helping students pursue careers in education. "I'll provide the initial funding," Richard said, "and I'd like you to be involved in selecting the recipients. You knew her best in her later years, and I think you'd have a unique perspective on what she would have wanted." Ethan was stunned. "You'd really do that?" he asked. "Absolutely," Richard replied. "It's the least I can do for someone who changed my life, and after reading about everything you've done for her, I can see you share her spirit of giving." Ethan glanced at his mom, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd love to help," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Thank you so much." As they left the cafe, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Mrs. Bennett had given him so much, not just her house or her savings, but her kindness, her wisdom, and her belief in him. Now, he had the chance to pass that on to others. The scholarship fund was announced later that summer, and the response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from former students, neighbors, and even strangers who had been touched by Mrs. Bennett's story. The first recipient was a young woman named Lily, who had always dreamed of becoming a teacher but couldn't afford the tuition. Ethan met her at the award ceremony and felt a deep sense of connection, knowing Mrs. Bennett's legacy would live on through her. As the years went by, Ethan continued to oversee the scholarship fund, each new recipient a reminder of the impact one person's kindness could have. And though he still missed Mrs. Bennett, he knew she would be proud of the path he was walking, one she had helped pave with her love and generosity.